My name is Alex, and I have the pleasure of presenting our presentation topic, which is on the conservation initiatives of the eastern Hellbender salamander. And so my group consists of myself, Alex, Cindy, Abby, and our Hellbender expert, Dr. Kathy Jakowski. So a quick introduction. The eastern Hellbender salamander is native to areas in the eastern United States and is the largest aquatic salamander in North America. It grows to about just over 2 feet in length, which is kind of crazy to think about. Kind of like, I don't know, almost the size of your arm, I guess, for the larger adults. And then it's considered a long-lived species with an average lifespan between 20 and 30 years. Its range is from southern New York to northern Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi. The image on the top of the slide in yellow is showing the eastern Hellbender salamander and its approximate range. There is 2 subspecies of Hellbender salamanders, the eastern, which is what this presentation is focusing on, and then the Ozark, and the Ozark range could be seen in that image as the orange over in Arkansas and Missouri. And then the Hellbender salamander's habitat is running, shallow, clear, high oxygenated mountain streams. And so you could see in this photo, the Hellbender salamander is just kind of hanging out. And it prefers more of like a larger rocky substrate. I think just because it's so big, it kind of forages and hangs out and hides in the larger rocky areas. Diving into the current status. So I read several studies on population status of this species, and a lot of them are really specific ecosystem or watershed specific, but the average consensus across the research I was looking at had anywhere from 70 to 80% in decline in total population of the Hellbender salamanders in the last few decades, and it is now unfortunately extirpated in Illinois and reduced to a single river basin in Indiana, where they historically were in both of those places. And so habitat status, there's ongoing research is needed to determine the exact relationship with the Hellbenders and their habitat status. However, several studies suggest decreasing habitat quality is negatively impacting the Hellbender populations. I think this is true with a lot of amphibians kind of across the board. Water quality, habitat loss and fragmentation, development, encroachment in riparian areas, and all that kind of stuff from what I was reading is definitely not helping the Hellbender and disrupting its habitat. And then the common threats are aquatic habitat pollution, dams and barriers fragmenting habitat, siltation of streams and rivers, unintentionally and intentionally being killed and poached by fishermen, and then also the chytrid fungus, which is supposedly really bad. So in 2021, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service listed the eastern Hellbender populations in Missouri specifically. So that specific DPS or distinct population segment as endangered. So that population in Missouri only. And though the species current range is largely the same as its historical range, the abundance or the number of individuals has dropped more than 70% since the 1970s. And then the eastern Hellbender has been listed as a near threatened under the IUCN, is under consideration for vulnerable status, and then New York State has also listed it as a species of special concern.
Hi, this is Abby Main. I'm going to be talking about the conservation efforts for the eastern Hellbenders. One of the first conservation efforts would be habitat protections, having more protected areas, whether that be federal, state, or local, gaining stricter regulations for Hellbender habitat. This is usually done through nonprofits, as once again, through government, Fish and Wildlife Services. And there was actually a study in West Virginia that showed that Hellbenders prefer waters with lots of gravel, cooler water, low conductivity, and are more acidic, so a pH below 7 for the Hellbender. So these are some considerations we can have in protecting their habitat. Another conservation effort for the Hellbender are breeding and then just reintroduction for the species. So this is done typically through zoos or aquariums. They tend to link up with universities and research centers to get these done. Eastern Hellbenders are bred in captivity, then put into habitats that they think they'll survive well in. That goal is obviously to increase their population size and also genetic diversity of the species. In Indiana specifically, there was a study where they saw that captive breeding was shown to not show as much survivorship as just translocating some of the species. So some of the captive breeding could use some extra help to get better. Another is improving their water quality because they're extremely sensitive to pollution is going to be a big one. And that's one of the biggest threats to hellbenders. So with pesticides, herbicides, just nutrient runoff in general, that's kind of what's killing them off. So we need to reduce runoff from both agricultural and industrial areas. That's extremely crucial. And also, that's going to requires regulation of private businesses. The last conservation effort is through education. So zoos, aquariums, schools, etc. Those are all beneficial at raising public awareness of conservation issues. Awareness tends to be the most important aspect of getting human beings to care about conservation. So if you know that the threats to the hellbender, you're more likely to care more. The National Zoo actually works heavily with hellbender conservation. They have a whole page on their website where they provide education to both kids and adults alike on how to preserve the hellbender. They also actually bred them using cryopreserved sperm and then also with biotechnology.
We would now like to introduce you to our expert, Dr. Catherine Jakowski. Dr. Jakowski is an assistant professor of wildlife ecology at Clemson University. Her current research focuses on ecology of freshwater species and the response to global change at the individual and population levels. Dr. Jakowski has over 20 years of experience studying the eastern hellbender. As an undergraduate, she was introduced to the species by a fellow student, and this encounter fueled a lifelong fascination with the hellbender and a drive to understand its ecology and conservation needs. She has since earned both master's and doctorate degrees with research focused on hellbender ecology and has held several technician positions focused on hellbender conservation. She currently oversees PhD students who are continuing the exploration into hellbender ecology by studying their population dynamics and their response to environmental stressors. Dr. Jakowski, thank you for joining us today.
Hello.
So our first question is, in your opinion, what is one of the greatest threats to the future of the hellbender population?
Yeah, when I think about what the biggest threats to hellbenders are, two things come to mind. One is habitat loss, specifically as a result of land use alteration. So they're restricted to streams their entire lives. They can't get up and move to another stream, unless it's connected. And so habitat in streams is degraded by lots of different things, but one of the most ubiquitous threats is just the shift of forested landscapes that provide a lot of riparian cover and protect water quality to landscapes, where people will clear the riparian forest to have either a nice view of the river or for agriculture to let livestock graze into streams. And sometimes even for urban development in urban settings. So whenever that happens, you see an influx of fine sediments, sand and silt move into the streams. You tend to see increased addition of chemical pollutants like pesticides, herbicides. All those things, they hit the stream in one point, but they also travel downstream. And so what we've learned is that you could have hellbenders in one place, and whether or not they're doing okay depends very much on what's happening upstream, which is not always visible. And so because they're in the stream and they're part of that network, they're susceptible to things happening a fair distance away from them. And there aren't a lot of incentives for people to protect that riparian land cover. So land use change is a big one, maybe the biggest. And then the other big threat that I think they face is with climate change. So just shifting patterns in both average temperatures, but also attributes of climatic regimes like rainfall patterns, which influence the flow dynamics in streams, or what we call the flow regime. So when are the peak flows in a stream? When do they happen? When are floods most likely to occur? When floods occur, how intense are those floods likely to be? And because hellbenders rely on these very specific rock crevices, and if their rocks are moved at a certain time of year, they have a hard time kind of reestablishing themselves, or they could have a nest they're protecting that's completely wiped out because of a flood event. So in a fair portion of their range, climate change forecasts suggest that the intensity and frequency of very high magnitude flood events is likely to increase. And I worry a lot about how even what we see as healthy populations now, how they'll fare with those shifting dynamics in the future.
Climate change is definitely one that kind of gets I don't want to say put on the back burner, but it's not one that immediately comes to mind when you think of flooding increase and water regime change in streams, especially freshwater streams up in the higher elevation areas. So I'm glad you pointed that one out. Thank you.
Yeah.
So what do you think is the strongest conservation method we have available today to help build the resiliency in the existing population?
I think we know that kind of the best or the strongholds of hellbender populations today are really in these, as you mentioned, kind of relatively high elevation streams that are completely contained within national forests, which are protected. I mean, national forests are used, they're logged, but they're logged sustainably and in a responsible way. And that's not always the case on private lands. And so protecting those national forests and ensuring that they remain intact, which is at the mercy of the federal government and their decisions moving forward. So that's, I think, the biggest tool we have to make sure hellbenders persist into the future. And I think beyond that, when you talk about private lands, any sort of best management practices or policies that can be put in place to increase the incentives for landowners to protect that riparian buffer are the biggest tool. And they're just not present. Even sometimes they're contained in best management practices, but those aren't laws. Best management practice might say we recommend leaving a 10-meter or a 20-meter riparian buffer, but that doesn't mean it has to be done. And so those laws vary a lot state to state, and unfortunately they're just not strong enough now, in my opinion, to ensure that hellbenders will persist in a lot of the places where they still occur today.
Are there any databases or any resource material that targets particular streams for acquisition to expand an existing conservation area?
There's not a big database on that includes current known locations of hellbenders for a couple of reasons. One of which is that in a lot of the range, there haven't been a lot of intensive surveys done, so we still don't know in many states where hellbenders are versus where they aren't. So most states within the range know a few places where hellbenders exist, but they just don't have the time and resources to survey all these unsurveyed areas and really figure out what's happening status-wise. So part of that is because of a lack of information. The other part, even with the known locations, they were in historic research papers. The specific locality of hellbender surveys were published, and it ended up in poaching, a lot of poaching for the species. So historically, hellbenders were intensively collected for scientific collection purposes. They were like a popular dissection item, right, in school dissections. So people just harvested them by the hundreds. It's crazy. And that was not sustainable. And then right today, we actually worry about poaching because of the pet trade. There's a lot of demand kind of in the black market to have a pet hellbender. States have all tried to kind of tighten down their regulations on collecting, and now those things are there. We've got federal protection that restricts import, export of those animals, but we still worry it would happen, and that it would happen within the United States if we were to release locations. So most of the time when you talk to people who work on hellbenders, they are very hesitant to tell you what streams they work in for that reason.
Understood.
Which is challenging because it's a double-edged sword. If you don't share the locations, you also can't tell people don't do that there because there are hellbenders. So I kind of have to. I work in some of the streams in the national forest that get a lot of public recreation impacts and tourism, and there, I feel like it's protected enough already that sharing information on hellbenders with the public can only help, because we can talk about how, you might want to build a rock dam to create a pool, but those are homes for animals, and if you move them, they may have trouble finding another home, and so I actually share, and I'll show the public hellbenders when I'm working with them, because I think it has more of a positive influence than protecting information about them would, if that makes sense.
No, I completely understand that. You're giving them a personal connection to the education you're trying to share. So that's vital. Thank you so much.
That was awesome. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you guys for featuring the hellbender and spreading the word. I'm always happy to participate in opportunity to teach people more about the most amazing animal on the planet.